Sony has made a big push this year to gain some traction in the US market, and the Xperia XZ is their newest flagship for the second half of 2016. From a design standpoint, it's been refreshed in a few different ways, but it still has that signature rectangular slab look that makes it easily recognizable as a Sony phone. The XZ is made from a combination of materials with glass on the front, an all-metal backplate, and plastic along the sides. It has what Sony calls a loop design, which basically means that the sides are rounded and tapered towards the front and the back to make the transition between the different materials feel more seamless, and also gives the phone a very comfortable feel in the hand. The build quality is what you expect from Sony. It feels very sturdy, and because it only has a 5.2-inch display, it's generally pretty easy to operate in one hand. It comes in a few different colors like blue, silver, and this black version that you see here, and the black is more of a satin finish. It's not super glossy, but it does still tend to pick up fingerprints, but overall the black on black gives this phone a very sleek and stealthy look. Because the back is completely made of metal with no plastic breaks or inserts, the NFC chip is not on the back of this phone where we normally expect it to be, and instead has been moved to the front next to the front-facing camera. This isn't the first time that we've seen Sony do this, but it does make tapping this phone to other devices or payment terminals a little bit more awkward. Unlike the X Compact that was announced right alongside the XZ is IP68 dust and water resistant, which means you can dunk it in water and use it in the rain, and it'll be perfectly fine. Going around the device, you have the headphone jack up top, USB Type-C port on the bottom, a SIM card slot that also doubles as a micro SD card slot on the left, and finally on the right side you have the power button, volume rocker, and Sony's signature dedicated camera shortcut key. Now, I said this in the Xperia X Compact review, and I'll say it here again for the Xperia XZ. Having the dedicated camera shortcut key is a very convenient and quick way to get into the camera, but having the power button, volume rocker, and camera key all on one side makes the whole right side of the phone feel very cluttered. Sony puts the volume buttons by the camera key to make controlling digital zoom with the camera feel much more natural, but for controlling volume, it's very awkward and uncomfortable to press with your thumb. The Xperia XZ's power button does function as a fingerprint sensor, but just like the X Compact and previous devices that Sony has released here in the States, the US version will not come with a fingerprint sensor, and it's unfortunate because fingerprint sensors are starting to become the norm in a lot of smartphones, and Sony hasn't exactly made it clear why it's getting left out. Audio is a pretty big part of the experience on the Xperia XZ. By plugging in a pair of headphones, you can take advantage of the XZ's built-in support for high-res audio files like FLAC, and it can upscale any compressed music files to give it more of a high-res sound. The Xperia XZ also has two small slits that sit above and below the display for stereo front-facing speakers, which sound great and don't get distorted, but in comparison to something like the Nexus 6P, they aren't anywhere near as loud and don't have as much low-end punch. The 5.2-inch display uses LCD technology with a resolution of 1080p, which some may be disappointed by simply because most high-end flagships, if not all of them, are coming with Quad HD displays, but unless you plan on using this phone for VR, you're not going to notice any difference. The screen still looks plenty sharp for comfortably reading text and web browsing, has excellent viewing angles, and is surprisingly very vibrant. It gets plenty bright that it's easily viewable outdoors, and you also have the usual white balance controls and Sony's X Reality engine built in to give you a sharper and more natural looking image when looking at photos and videos. There's also some benefits to having a lower resolution display. One of those benefits is performance. The XZ has 3 GB of RAM instead of the usual 4 that we've been getting accustomed to on flagships, but it does come with the Snapdragon 820, which we all know is a great processor. With a 1080p panel, the processor won't have to work as hard to push all those pixels, so you'll generally get much smoother gameplay and graphics performance because there's less strain on the GPU. And gameplay on the XZ is definitely very smooth. Games looked great, and I never noticed any stutters or drop frames with high-end playing games. Day-to-day operations such as web browsing, opening apps, checking emails, watching videos has also been very smooth, and despite having 3 GB of RAM, I haven't managed to slow this phone down with heavy amounts of multitasking. The software also plays a big part in why this phone performs so well. It's running Android 6.0 Marshmallow with Sony's custom skin, but Sony has scaled back a lot of their customizations to keep the experience fairly light. You still have Sony's own launcher, settings menu, app icons, and a built-in theme engine, but the majority of the experience feels very close to stock, and they've even added the Google Now home screen into their own launcher that makes it feel even more like stock Android. Even though this phone is unlocked and free of carriers, it does come with quite a few pre-installed bloatware applications like AVG protection, Amazon Shopping, and Sony's own list of apps, but otherwise it's a very clean and simple Android experience. At 2900 mAh, the Xperia XZ has a relatively small battery in comparison to a lot of flagships out there, but it's been more than good enough to last me comfortably through a day, but don't expect it to last much more beyond just a single day. Even with a few hours of gaming per day on top of the usual social media, email, and texting, I still managed at least 12 hours off the charger, which is definitely not bad for heavy usage, so I could imagine this phone lasting much longer for people who don't play a lot of games or videos on their smartphone. It does come with Quick Charge 3.0 to make it easy and quick to charge back up, but if you're really hurting for battery life and can't get to a charger, you do have Sony's usual stamina and ultra stamina modes that limit certain functions and performance in favor of longer battery life. Sony's been known to make some really great camera sensors for smartphones. However, when it came to their own smartphones, they never managed to get the camera quite right, but they've made a lot of improvements to this new sensor on the XZ. It's sharing the same 23 megapixel rear camera as the smaller X Compact with 5-axis image stabilization, and they've added a new laser autofocus sensor and a color sensor to help you get the most accurate white balance no matter the lighting situation. Something to note about the 5-axis image stabilization is that it's purely software based, so there's no physical moving parts here to make this all happen, and the 5-axis image stabilization only kicks in when you're recording close-ups or macro shots. Otherwise, you're getting 3-axis stabilization, but even then, Sony's in-camera stabilization works extremely well for video and stabilizes the footage without any noticeable warping or distortion. Where the XZ differs from the X Compact is with the front-facing camera. Instead of 5 megapixels, you have a 13 megapixel shooter, which works very well for taking selfies. There's plenty of detail and color, and at 13 megapixels, this gives you a lot more flexibility with zooming and cropping. The rest of the camera experience is pretty typical Sony. The camera app is fairly simplistic, and navigating between Superior Auto, manual, video recording, or switching to the front-facing camera can all be done by simply swiping on the screen, and you also have all of Sony's usual fun and playful modes like AR effect, sweep panorama, and time shift video. The only quirk with Sony's camera app is that HDR mode still continues to be buried in the settings and only accessible when shooting in manual mode, but otherwise it's a mostly straightforward camera app. The camera itself is very quick to launch and snap photos, especially with the dedicated camera key, and the pictures that it takes are surprisingly very good. They're extremely sharp and detailed, and it produces colors that are much more natural and true to life, but at the same time are still very pleasing to the eye. The predictive hybrid autofocus feature that Sony has been using for a while now also works well for tracking moving subjects and capturing them without motion blur, and as long as the subject is moving at a reasonable speed, you'll be able to get a crystal clear shot. In low light, there's still a fair amount of detail and the images come out relatively noise-free, but it does tend to overexpose and have a lot of blooming in the highlights. The camera can also be really slow to capture in low light situations, and if you aren't holding the phone perfectly steady, you'll wind up getting a lot of blurry shots. If you're looking to get this phone, the price is going to be something to contend with. At $700, it's not exactly an impulse purchase and puts it in the same price range as other flagships like the S7 Edge and Google's brand new Pixel phones. Then there's phones at the other end of the spectrum like the Axon 7 and OnePlus 3 that offer flagship experiences at a fraction of the price. I will admit that I generally do like this phone, and it's the first time in a long while that a Sony phone has impressed me. It's got a refreshing, new, and beautiful design that at the same time is still true to Sony, and it has a beautiful display, excellent performance, and a really great camera. There was so much to like about this phone that I was able to forgive things like a lack of a fingerprint sensor and a QHD screen. Is it $700 forgivable? To most people, it might not be, but if you choose to buy it, you're getting the best phone that Sony has made in a long while. As always, thank you guys